331 BC. On one side, a Persian king with an army so vast it took 8 days just to cross the river. On the other, a 25-year-old with 47,000 men, outnumbered maybe 5 to 1. By nightfall, the largest empire the world had ever seen would cease to exist. This is Gaugamela, the battle that made Alexander the Great. But to understand why this single day shook the foundations of civilization, we have to go back. Not just to the weeks before the battle, but to a world that believed with absolute certainty that Persia could never fall. The weight of an empire. For 2 centuries, the Achaemenid Persian Empire had been the undisputed master of the known world. Stretching from the shores of the Aegean Sea to the banks of the Indus River, it was a colossus unlike anything humanity had ever constructed. At its height, it controlled nearly half the world's population. Its kings, the great kings, called themselves King of Kings, and no one laughed. They meant it, and the world believed it. Darius III, who sat on the Golden Throne in 331 BC, was not a weak man. History has sometimes been unkind to him, painting him as a coward in Alexander's long shadow, but the truth is more complex and more human. Darius had seized the throne through cunning and survival. He had faced Alexander once already at the Battle of Issus in 333 BC, and though he had fled, he had not broken. He had regrouped, he had rebuilt. And now, on a wide, flat plain in what is today northern Iraq, near a village called Gaugamela, he had chosen his ground with deliberate strategic precision. Darius had actually ordered the battlefield to be leveled, flattened, cleared of rocks and uneven terrain. Because he had a weapon Alexander did not, scythed chariots, war machines with blades extending from their axles, designed to tear through infantry formations like a scythe through wheat. He needed open ground for them to be effective. He had also assembled 200 of these fearsome vehicles. He had 15 war elephants from India. He had cavalry superiority. And by most estimates, he had somewhere between 250,000 and possibly far more soldiers, though ancient sources, as always, exaggerate. Conservative modern estimates still place the Persian force at a staggering numerical advantage. Darius believed this was his moment of redemption. He had written to Alexander, offering peace, territory, and his daughter's hand in marriage. Alexander's general Parmenion had reportedly said, "I would accept if I were Alexander." To which Alexander had replied, "So would I if I were Parmenion." Alexander had not come this far to negotiate. The young king. Who was this young man who dared to stare down the Persian Empire? Alexander of Macedon had been king since the age of 20, ascending after the assassination of his father, Philip II, the military genius who had forged Macedonia into a war machine. Alexander had inherited that machine, refined it, and then pointed it eastward with a singular, almost mythological ambition to reach the edge of the world. He had been tutored by Aristotle. He slept with a copy of Homer's Iliad under his pillow, annotated by his teacher alongside a dagger. He idolized Achilles and genuinely believed himself to be descended from Heracles on one side and Achilles on the other. This was not mere vanity. It was the fuel of his relentless drive. He did not just want to conquer, he wanted to become legend. And yet Alexander was also a supremely practical military mind. He had already proven himself at the battles of Granicus and Issus. He had taken Egypt without a fight, been declared a son of the god Amun at the Oracle of Siwa, and founded Alexandria, a city that would outlast him by millennia. Now his eyes were fixed on Persepolis, the jeweled heart of the empire he intended to claim. On the night before Gaugamela, his generals were anxious. Parmenion, the veteran commander, suggested a night attack, hit them in the dark before the Persians could deploy their superior numbers. Alexander refused. He would not, he said, steal a victory. He wanted to defeat Darius in open daylight before the eyes of the world without ambiguity or shadow. Then, astonishingly, Alexander slept. So deeply, so peacefully that his generals had to wake him the next morning. When asked how he could possibly sleep before such a battle, he replied simply that the hard work, the endless marching, the strategic preparation, was already done. The victory, he seemed to believe, was inevitable. Whether that was supreme confidence or supreme delusion, history would soon deliver its verdict. The field of Gaugamela, October 1st, 331 BC dawn. The Persian army spread across the plain like a living sea. The scale was psychologically overwhelming. Soldiers, cavalry, chariots, and elephants arranged across a front that dwarfed anything Alexander's men had ever faced. The Greeks and Macedonians, veterans though they were, must have felt the ground tremble with the weight of what stood before them. Alexander rode along his lines. He wore a brilliant white tunic, a gleaming breastplate, and a helmet with 2 white plumes, chosen not for decoration but to be seen. He needed his men to see him everywhere. He needed them to believe that where he was, victory followed. The battle began with the Persian scythed chariots, Darius's great trump card. They thundered forward toward the Macedonian lines, but Alexander had prepared for this. His men opened their ranks deliberately, letting the chariots pass through. Soldiers on the flank struck at the horses and drivers with javelins. Most of the chariots were neutralized before they could cause the devastation Darius had planned. The first great Persian gamble failed. Then came the moment of supreme tactical brilliance, or supreme audacity, depending on your perspective. As the battle developed across the wide front, Alexander noticed something. The Persian line, stretched thin to prevent encirclement, had begun to show a gap, a seam, a vulnerability. This was partly by design. Alexander had been deliberately moving his cavalry to the right, drawing the Persian left flank outward, creating exactly this opening. In a moment that historians have analyzed for over 2,000 years, Alexander formed his companion cavalry, his elite horsemen, into a wedge formation. And then, with a war cry, he personally led the charge, not from behind, not from safety. He aimed directly for the gap in the Persian line and drove straight toward Darius himself. The shock of the charge was total. The Persian center began to fracture. Darius, surrounded by chaos, made the decision that would define his legacy. He fled. For the second time, the King of Kings turned his chariot and rode from Alexander's fury. When Darius fled, the battle did not end immediately. It raged for hours more. On the left, Parmenian's forces were nearly overwhelmed, and Alexander had to wheel his cavalry around to relieve them. The cost was real. The struggle was genuine, but the psychological moment, the flight of the great king, had already shattered the Persian will. By nightfall, Gaugamela belonged to Alexander. The aftermath. The numbers, as best as we can determine them, were staggering. Persian casualties numbered in the tens of thousands. The Macedonian losses, by comparison, were a fraction. Darius escaped, but he would not escape for long. He was murdered by his own satraps the following year, betrayed by the men who had once served him. Alexander marched on to Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the empire. There, in a moment that remains deeply debated by historians, the royal palace was burned. Whether it was a deliberate political act, a symbolic end to the Persian wars begun by Xerxes a century and a half before, or a drunken accident at a party, we cannot say with certainty. Perhaps both stories carry a grain of truth. What is certain is this: the Achaemenid Persian Empire, 2 centuries in the making, was over. The world remade. Alexander's victory at Gaugamela did not just change borders on a map, it changed the DNA of civilization itself. In the decades and centuries that followed, Greek language, art, philosophy, and culture flooded eastward across Persia, Mesopotamia, Egypt, and into the edges of India. This period, the Hellenistic Age, became the bridge between the classical Greek world and the rise of Rome. It was the era in which East and West began their long, complicated, endlessly rich conversation. The Library of Alexandria, the philosophy of the Stoics, the spread of scientific inquiry, all of it carried the fingerprints of Alexander's conquests. And at the center of it all, a single afternoon on a flat plain in Mesopotamia, where a 25-year-old looked across at an empire and decided it was his. We study Gaugamela not only because of what was destroyed, but because of what was born in its aftermath. The world that emerged from that dust and blood was more connected, more culturally complex, and more intellectually alive than what came before it. Alexander died just 8 years later in Babylon at the age of 32. He had never lost a battle. He had never quite reached the edge of the world he was looking for, but he had irrevocably changed it. Gaugamela lasted one day. Its echoes have lasted 2.5 millennia, and on some level they are still reaching us now.